Good afternoon. Good afternoon to everybody who is coming to join me today. My name is Darren Lester, and I am here to talk to you all about Chinese science fiction. We are talking about what science fiction has to offer. We are talking about why Chinese science fiction in particular is worth talking about, why Chinese science fiction is worth being aware of, kind of just on the grand scheme of things, in terms of genre fiction, in terms of what's happening in publishing, in terms of all of that good stuff. We are going to be looking at some Chinese writers to watch out for who are available in translation if you are watching and you are not a speaker of Chinese, and of course, whom you can read in Chinese in the first language. If you do indeed read Chinese, I can see that people are coming in. Hello, hello, hello. It's lovely to have you here. I'm always so happy when my kind of geeky niche little talks get some attention, because when I pitched this one to Jonathan, who runs the language show, I did say to him, Chinese science fiction is a very small domain. It's a very, very niche domain. So, I'm not sure if we will get very many people who are interested. So it is lovely to see all of you coming in. What I'm going to do, just while we're kind of waiting for the numbers to stabilize, I will ask you, if you can, to let me know in the chat who you are and where you are from, because of course I can't hear you. It's only a case of you can hear me. So if you don't mind, of course you're under no obligation to do so. You can just sit back and kind of listen, hopefully be entertained, hopefully be informed a little bit by what I have to say. But if you would like to engage, I have the webinar chat open. So it would be really good for me to know who you are, where you come from, kind of what your level of Chinese is, if any, so that I can tailor the recommendations that I have. Again, if you don't want to, that is absolutely fine. I'm going to try to leave a minute or two. I'm going to try and leave some time at the end to take any questions that we might have. Those, I think, can probably go into the chat, because the chat will move quite slowly. But if you absolutely want me to see your question, pop it into the Q&A. If I then don't have time to answer any questions at the end, because fair warning, I can talk. So if we run out of time, I will make sure that I leave my details, my social media details, at the end, and I would encourage you to keep in touch. So we have a guest has popped in to say, a lapsed upper elementary Chinese learner, lover of fantasy and sci-fi books. Perfect. You are my perfect attendee, I think. Chris, good to have you here. Chris is in the UK working with a few different languages. Nice to have another plurilinguist in the chat here, Saoirse. Hello, Saoirse. I did indeed teach you a bit at Wycliffe. And then you did German at uni. You know no Chinese, but translation and sci-fi sounds interesting. Well, thank you very much. I'm really glad to have you here. I will let, unless you have already, but I will let Mrs. Stevens Mukesh know that you dropped in. But also, maybe not necessarily in the chat here, but just send me an email over to my school email address. Let me know how you're getting on. Let me know what you have done since uni, because that is very, very cool. And it's really nice to see you again. So, Chinese science fiction, like I have said, is a super niche area. Okay, science fiction in general is very niche. Asian literature, particularly in the English speaking world, is very niche. You bring them together and you have an area that not many people know very much about. However, it is beginning to grow, particularly among first language English speaking people. So my inspiration for this talk actually is R.F. Kuang. So I'm just reading The Burning God, which is huge. I don't know if you know this series. It's very, very good. I highly recommend it. It's called the Poppy War series. And R.F. Kuang, as you can probably guess from her name, is a Chinese writer. She's Chinese American, I believe. The R stands for Rebecca, which isn't a typically Chinese name, but Rebecca Kwong is currently studying for her PhD in East Asian language and literature at Yale, sorry. Um, and her books, so the Poppy Trilogy series, Yellowface, which of course is a contemporary, and Babel. Okay, so guest has just mentioned Babel there in the chat. I've not read that one yet. I've heard some really good things about it, but good to me because the person who recommended it to me said that it read like a textbook, and I was absolutely on board just from there. So the fact that you've loved it as well means that I might move it up my TBR a little bit, but I do absolutely recommend the Poppy War trilogy. So it is 3 books. Burning God is the last one. It is the thickest. The middle one, Dragon Republic, is about a third of this size. And Poppy War is probably about the same. So it is an investment of time, um, but it's very, very much worth reading. And I think that as particularly R.F. Kuang as a specific author, as she becomes more prevalent and as she becomes um, more recognized within the English language publishing world, I think we're going to see more Chinese fantasy in translation and also more Asian inspired fantasy coming through. And so I think for people like us who are clearly genre fiction fans and who have this interest in the Asian fiction, I think this is going to be a good time for us. I've got a feeling. So, like I said, the whole point of this one is for me to kind of take you through the highs, lows, and highs again of Chinese science fiction because it has quite an interesting history, and to recommend some of my favorite authors, some people that I think would be good for you to keep an eye out for. But also, I like recommendations. I like to know what people are reading. So if, as we're going through, I mention an author or I mention a book and you've got another recommendation or you've got a comp, you've got something that is comparable that we might also like, do pop it into the chat. The other thing that I have been toying with and I would be interested in your perspective on is whether there would be any interest in a Zoom Chinese or Asian fiction reading group. And maybe we would, become a little book club, meet once a month, for example, here on Zoom, having all read the same book or short story, and discuss it. So again, I would be really interested if you've got any ideas, any strong opinions on that. I'd be interested to know what you have to say. So let's start by talking about what science fiction actually is, what it offers, why it is part of our zeitgeist. The most important thing about science fiction, both from an Asian perspective and a Western perspective, and again, I'm recognizing the fact that I am now talking for an Asian audience as a British person. But what science fiction does is it offers this tapestry of imagination and of speculation. So many of you, I'm sure, will have also come across the term speculative fiction. That's another way that sci-fi is termed, particularly in literary magazines and literary circles. So if you've ever seen that concept before and you weren't quite sure what it meant, that's what it is. Literary fiction, speculative fiction is essentially science fiction. It gives us the opportunity to explore different perspectives and what science means from those perspectives. And this is what particularly drew me to Chinese science fiction, to Asian science fiction in general, was this idea that it gave me an understanding of the Asian mindset. It gave me a better understanding of what it is to function in a typically Asian society. because that's what literature does. Literature holds up a mirror to society, even speculative literature, even fantasy, even high fantasy. It tells you a lot about the culture and the context in which it was written. And so, you can read these books that are about spaceships, that are about meeting aliens and what happens when they come to Earth. But how those spaceships are built, how those interpersonal relationships between the aliens and the people are formed, how the planets are named, they all give you an insight both into the language and the culture of the book's origin. The other thing that it helps us to do when we track the history of genre fiction is it helps us to track the history of a country, because quite often what will happen is, particularly in countries where you're not allowed or you're not encouraged to speak out against the government, for example, or guerrilla forces or whatever it might be, you can hide that message within genre fiction. We've seen that in LGBTQ plus spaces, and how the in the Victorian era, LGBTQ plus writers would write their characters, they would write their queer characters, and would then kill them off in order for that to be accepted within the society. And we can kind of track when that started, and we can track changing attitudes towards LGBTQ plus people by tracking that kind of fiction. And we can do exactly the same with science fiction and with fantasy. And of course, from a Chinese context, where there has been a lot of upheaval and a lot of change in a very short space of time, that's really, really important. It also helps us to bridge scale, the macro versus the micro. China, of course, operates on a macro scale. China is huge. We know that, both in terms of sheer landmass, in terms of the number of people, in terms of the impact of its language. Just the impact of China is beyond measure. But what we can do is we can look at the impact of China, and we can put that into a sci-fi setting to say, what if this fictional kingdom that is as big as China were bigger? What if these small kingdoms that make up this fake China in my historical fantasy never came together? What would the world look like then? And it allows us to explore the positives and the negatives, the benefices and the archetypes of history in a way that we can't because it didn't happen. So again, it's that speculation. So sci-fi in general is really important for allowing us to understand ourselves, to understand where we come from, and as lovers of Asian culture, to understand where that culture has come from and how those cultures are different to our own. So, sci fi in China actually has a very recent history, particularly when you consider the history of literature in China. Okay, so literature on the whole in China goes way, way back. We're talking thousands of years. All right, China continues to be one of the oldest living language systems. It has one of the oldest perpetually in use alphabets. It's a way that we can track our history. We can track the history of humanity pretty much through Chinese. But science fiction doesn't rear its head until 1900. Now, we have fantasy, and in fact, the bulk of Chinese literature before 1900 is fantasy. If you take the four great novels, and I'm going to use my favorite of the four, Journey to the West, as an example, that is a fantasy story. If you're not aware of the four great novels, they are the four classical Chinese books that are considered to be the archetype of Chinese literature. They are the best of the best. Okay, I highly recommend Journey to the West. It's the story of the Monkey King and his attempt to become a Buddha, essentially. And we have a lot of fantastical elements therein because it is a religious story, and it does try to marry traditional Chinese beliefs with Buddhism. And again, we can see how that happened. We can see that synchronicity. We can see what happened in China when Buddhism started to become more important and when the native religion began to step back a little bit. And we can chart that through the literature. So in 1900, we get the first example of science fiction in China. And ironically enough, it's translated literature. So, if anybody saw my talk last year about reading literature in translation, you will remember that I said there is almost a snobbishness associated with being able to say, oh, yes, I read this book in its original language. And I know that it's there because I've done it. I've read Journey to the West in Chinese. I've read Battle Royale in Japanese, and I've had it come out of my mouth. Oh yes, I read that in the original Latin. But actually, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what language you read the book in. Yes, reading it in the original language can help with some of the ideas. It can help to spark your imagination. And of course, if you're a learner of the original language, it's good for your vocabulary. But actually, as long as you're reading it at all, the ideas are there, and anything that is in the language that needs to be put across will be done by a skillful translator. Okay, so please don't, if you are as guest was, and I'm sorry to keep calling you guest, that's kind of just how you've come up in the chat. And you're a lapsed upper intermediate learner, or if you have very strong Chinese, hi Nicole, thank you for letting me know. Um, or indeed, if you've got no Chinese at all, but you want a hook, you want to get into it, don't be embarrassed about reading literature in translation because the Chinese did. This whole genre exists in China because a French book, Around the World in 80 Days, was translated into Chinese. With the reading of Around the World in 80 Days, Chinese intellectuals became obsessed with the Western idea of science. So China had science, and China had, as it still has, a kind of intermingling between science and folk medicine, folk magic, and religion. But with Around the World in 80 Days, what happened was the Chinese were introduced to this idea that Westerners have a completely different way of thinking. And they really latched onto it. They really got involved. And Lu Xun, who is one of the most famous Chinese writers of all time. Again, if you're not aware of Lu Xun, I did do a presentation on him at the Language Show a couple of years ago. He is credited as being the father of modern Chinese literature. He helped to pioneer the transition between traditional Chinese characters and simplified Chinese characters. Lu Xun is very, very influential. He said that science fiction, Around the World in 80 Days, gives us tools to improve thinking and assist culture. Because it's this comparative culture at the beginning of the 20th century that is really important for a Chinese audience. China is a very poor country at this time. It's a country of farmland. It's a country of mass poverty. And it's a country of people wanting a way out. And so a lot of writers, a lot of people like Lu Xun were latching on to science fiction as a way of saying, look, this is what other countries are able to do. You know, no, France can't get around the world in 80 days, but they do have this hot air balloon. And that's quite cool. If they can do that, what can we do? And so science fiction in the early 20th century became a way of giving people hope. It was a way of saying to these poor people whose crops had just failed, look, I know you're going to have a very hard time right now, but if we wait and if we take these ideas from these books, from the Westerners, then we can get better. And again, as a Western person, I feel quite uncomfortable saying that because it feels quite imperialist of me. But that was the mentality at the time. The Chinese at this point were very much looking to the West for ideas of how to make China better. Lu Xun himself left China in order to study medicine in Japan, and then he came over to Europe before going back to Japan and then back to China. China was opening up to the world, and it really opened. You weren't anybody if you hadn't done a year abroad. And so, China really did want to improve. It didn't want to change. It didn't want to lose what made it Chinese. It knew that it had something special, but it did want to get better. And it was more than happy to look at Europe as a way of doing that and to look at science fiction as a way of finding out what Europe was doing. Then we come into the People's Republic, so 1949. So this is where revolutions have happened. This is where communism is really beginning to take root. And science fiction was being used essentially as a propaganda tool to get people into STEM. And I'm actually very surprised that this hasn't happened in Europe because there's been a big push in the European education system in England, but all across Europe to get more people studying science and technology and engineering and maths. And yet, no one seems to have latched onto science fiction as a way to do that. But China did. So by 1949, science fiction in China had become a children's genre, but it was hard sci-fi. So it was rooted in reality. If you go back to any science fiction books or short stories from China from the 1940s, 1950s, you will find that everything is doable. Everything is very, very plausible. There's nothing outlandish. There's nothing fantastical there. It's all about what can we do? Let's make sure that we can do this. It was also influenced by what was happening in the Soviet Union at the time. And the Soviet Union, of course, was promoting overtly socialist literature. And so China was following suit because China was looking at these countries, like I've just said, and going, that's great. We're going to do that to improve, to get better. Then the Cultural Revolution happened. The Cultural Revolution was the point in Chinese history where the country, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, took on this hostile attitude towards the West. And so during this time, Mao's ideologies really drove communism home. It demonized capitalism, and there was no longer a place for anything that was deemed Western, including science fiction. And this was the period 1966 to 1976. And so, absolutely, as Ollie has just said in the chat, this sort of thing was also happening in Europe. Not the revolution, of course, but the push for science fiction, the push for getting people interested in science. And to me, it's no coincidence that where we see the rise in European science fiction at this time, China goes through the Cultural Revolution and their science fiction diminishes. And that was very deliberate. That was very overt. It wasn't an anti-science attitude. It was an anti-Western attitude. It was a case of anything Western is bad. We're going to get back to our roots, our classical roots, and we're going to make China what it was. So we have a kind of a black hole of science fiction in China at this time during this decade, because it just wasn't allowed, even as satire, even as propaganda. It just didn't exist. If it was Western, it wasn't allowed in. After the Cultural Revolution, and those of you who are au fait with Chinese history might be chuckling right now because I have very much brushed over the Cultural Revolution. There's a lot to it. It's a very interesting period. So if you are interested and you're not too sure about it, do go back and research. But after the Cultural Revolution, so during the 1970s and the 1980s, we see the return of the Western influence. And so what we have, interestingly, is we have Japan opening up. And we have across Europe people saying, oh, Japan is going to be the big leading Asian country. In education, we've got people saying you should learn Japanese. In media and entertainment, we've got Japanese anime, we've got Japanese science fiction being translated and brought over. The big anime boom, which continues to be popular now, begins in Europe at this time. And this is where Chinese science fiction begins to ask the question of what is science versus what is fiction. And it begins to diverge into that speculative genre. So it doesn't exist to inform anymore, but to entertain. And again, we have a good point in the chat here from Ollie, who has said, that's why I love Star Trek, uniting all the cultures through sci-fi. So that was at this same time when science fiction again became less Asimov and it became less hard science fiction and more speculative, more about people, and more about entertainment. And this is the time where the incoming literary tropes solidified it as a genre. So, in my opinion, out of all genre fiction, I think science fiction is the one that has the most shared genre tropes between the West and the East, between Chinese science fiction and British, for example, or American, because it was becoming very much solidified here as a genre. In the 1990s, we have this Renaissance era. So we finally have the emergence of Chinese sci-fi magazines. So things stop being, great big tomes of books, and they start being like we've had in Europe for a little while at this time, short stories. It becomes aligned with Western science fiction in that it uses this speculation to critique what's going on in the present. So it's okay to start critiquing again. It's okay to start not bad mouthing the government, but pointing out that there are flaws in society. So what we've had is 1900 science fiction coming in and saying, this is what's not going so well in China right now, but this is how we could fix it. Through to 1950s, 1960s, going, this is what's really cool, and this is how Chinese people are approaching it. Then that period, 60s, 70s, not allowed, doesn't exist, there is no science fiction. Through to the 90s, where it's going, society isn't doing so well, what can we do? And that's the kind of that's the pattern tracking that I was talking about before. That's how we can track how Chinese society as a whole changed its opinion towards its country over that century, where it went from we're very poor, but we can get better, to we got better, to we don't want anything to do with Europe, to yeah, actually, Europe's not so bad after all, but this is what's going wrong. And I think that's really, really interesting. I think as somebody who is interested in language, who is interested in people, it's a good way to track attitudes. We also see a bit like, again, in Europe, where everything in the 1990s was very gritty, very grungy, very realistic. We start to see a pessimism towards science, and dystopian literature becomes more prevalent. But what is interesting is, again, as Ollie has said, science fiction is the seed of hope. And even dystopian literature has hope in it, because dystopian literature, at its very core, says, what is the worst that could happen? And then if we've explored the very worst through literature, through something that is fake, we can begin to fix it. We can make sure that we don't get that far. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, he says, checking the time, a quick history charting the 120 years of science fiction in China. It's a baby genre in Chinese terms. Okay, there are not that many people at all. However, we do have a lot of emerging writers, and we do have some really exciting people to look out for. And I'm just going to take you through a few of them. Now, I imagine that most of you here will know about Liu Cixin. He is the author of The Three Body Problem, which is archetypal Chinese science fiction. Okay, if you were to ask any native speaker, any Chinese person to name a work of Chinese fiction, it is likely that they will name The Three Body Problem. The Three Body Problem is interestingly named after an actual mathematical theorem that I don't understand because I'm not a mathematician. And so we are seeing through Liu Cixin's work this return to hard sci-fi, this return to basing science fiction within reality. And this is a bit of a pattern that I'm noticing because, again, like I said at the top, even though it's fantasy and not sci-fi, R.F. Kuang is getting her advanced degree in East Asian languages and literature. And she's taking everything that she has learnt from that and putting it into her books. Xiren Zhao, who wrote Iron Widow, has done the same. She's created this science fiction realm, which becomes an alternate history. If you haven't read Iron Widow and you are interested in mecha fiction, if you are interested in things like Pacific Rim or even Godzilla and Ultraman, I would recommend picking up Iron Widow because that's a very good book to read, and it has a sequel coming out hopefully soon. But we see these writers who are very intelligent, very knowledgeable, and they are taking what they know and putting it into their fiction. And I think for me, that's why Chinese science fiction is so successful. Because it's not as if I were to try and write a sci fi story, in which case I would just have to make up a bunch of stuff because I don't know how spaceships might work. I could come up with an alien language, that would be fine, but the hard science bit I couldn't do. And so it wouldn't ring true. It would hopefully be entertaining, but it wouldn't have heart. Whereas you've got these people who are, like I've said, learned, who are knowledgeable, taking what they know and making it into science fiction. And that hooks. That hooks. So here, just in case you wanted some English titles, we have got some of Liu Cixin's work. So we've got the three body problem there right on the end, with a forward there by Ken Liu. Now, Ken Liu is amazing. He's more of a fantasy writer. Um, but he has written lots and lots of short stories. He has written lots of books. He's very prevalent. His big series, and again, all of these are really chunky. I'm looking up at my bookshelf to grab the title. Is The Grace of Kings. Again, that's fantasy rather than science fiction, but definitely worth having a look at. But we've got The Wandering Earth, we've got Hold Up the Sky, and we've got Supernova Era. And I don't know whether you can see it too well, but there on the title of The Wandering Earth, it points out that Liu Cixin has won a Hugo Award, which is one of the biggest prizes for science fiction, if not the biggest prize specifically for science fiction writing in the English-speaking world. And so people are taking notice, and that's again what I think is quite important. The hipster in me kind of wants to go, well, I liked Chinese science fiction before it was popular, but actually the realist in me understands that the more we have literature either in translation or not, because I can't expect everybody to go out and learn to read Chinese just to be able to read these books. The more we can learn from each other, just like China was trying to do originally, just like was the point of science fiction in China. This is Hui. And I wanted to make sure that I got a mix here of male and female authors. So she's gained a lot of recognition in the speculative fiction domain for her advocacy, specifically in Chinese science fiction. Um, she is very well known for her critical analysis. She actually teaches at the university level. She is a very strong editor and a very strong writer in the genre. Um, she focuses on the exploration and discussion of a range of different themes, particularly the taking of ancient Chinese literary tropes and updating them. She has shaped the landscape, I would say, of Chinese science fiction. And I think, again, that's very important. I think it's very important that we recognize the role of women in science fiction because it can be seen as a bit of a boys' club. And I think it's very important that we recognize um, the role of Asian women, particularly, because it is still, as a Chinese woman, there is still a lot of inherent sexism in the workplace. And so to be this shapely in Chinese science fiction is a real a boon for her. So she has written lots and lots of short stories, which you can find via Clarkesworld magazine. Now, what I will do, because I haven't made that link interactive, what I will do is I will tweet out the link at the end. I'll give you my Twitter details at the end of the presentation, and I will pop a link in a tweet out to her list of literature in translation. But here you can see she's written a story called No Way Back. That was in 2020. She's written a story called Rainship. That was published in 2017. She's written The Calculations of Artificials back in 2016. And Clarkesworld, again, in case you're not sure, in case you're relatively new to science fiction, Clarkesworld is one of the places you want to get published. And so for her to have that as a Chinese writer, as a Chinese female writer, is a real success. And her stories are very, very good. I mean, again, there, if we look at the extract we have of Rainship, the funeral was as simple as I expected. Visitors passed by the coffin one by one. The cold moss light was centered on the coffin's translucent lid. Under the dim lighting, Abani's face seemed once more full and round. Her final hours had been painful, but fortunately for all of us, she hadn't held out too long. I think that's beautiful. I think even in translation, that is beautiful writing. And again, we've got those Chinese elements in there. We've got this idea of her face, Abani's face, being full and round. And of course, in Chinese culture, that is about plenty. That's about being rich. And so I'm intrigued, I would be intrigued to know what was going on in Abani's life, that she was able to be rich, she was able to be well nourished, but also, why is it once more? What had happened to her that it wasn't? And I think that she has a really good way of hooking you in right from the beginning. This is Han Song. Han Song is known for his imaginative storytelling and his incisive critique of Chinese society. So he's one that uses fiction, that uses science fiction to critique what is currently going on. He has had numerous awards and accolades for his contribution to science fiction, particularly within China. And his stories, his books are lauded for their originality and for their depth. They are an easy read, but they are a deep read. They are that kind of perfect storm, I think, of accessible and philosophical. And it's not always to get a book that is both. Sometimes you can have accessible and fluffy, and sometimes you have philosophical and difficult to read. But I think Han Song does a really good job at mingling the two. So this is some of his selected works. We've got Ren Xiaoren, which is translated twice, once as artificial humans and once as can we clone humans. So that's just, it's about the artificiality, it's about what it means to be human. We've got Gravestone of the Universe, A Declaration of the Power of the Imagination, Haunted Site Investigations, The Ancient Ship of the Desert, Red Ocean, Ditie, Subway, Let's Look for Aliens Together, and Mars Shines on America. So there, just from the titles, you can get a sense of his playfulness. You can get a sense of his imagination and his desire just to have fun with his writing. Hao Jingfang is again another very prominent female writer in Chinese science fiction circles. I might have to pick up my notes because it's got so dark here that I can't actually see what I've written. Um, she is known for her intellect. She's a very clever woman, and her stories are very stimulating. They are very intellectual. They sometimes can be a little dense. They sometimes can be a little difficult to get into. But she somehow, and I would love to know how she does it because I would love to be able to do it, but she is able to intertwine futurism and speculation and social commentary and philosophy. And she mixes it all together and it works. She's also only a year older than me, which is very depressing. But again, interestingly, she holds a PhD. Her PhD is in economics. One of her most notable works is the novella Folding Beijing, which has also won the Hugo Prize. It won the Hugo Award for Best Novelette in 2016. And that's about a future Beijing where the city is divided into different zones. And each zone has its own economic difficulties, it has its own social disparity. And so you get this world building, you get these social issues. Um, it's kind of like Hunger Games, but without the murderous children. That's kind of where they're going with that one. We have The Last Brave Man, Invisible Planets, and The New Year Train as her short stories, Folding Beijing as her novella, and then Vagabonds is her novel. I'll be honest, I've not read Vagabonds yet. It's on my TBR, but I just haven't got to it. I would suggest with her starting with the short stories, if you are going to, then moving on to Folding Beijing, and then probably moving on to Vagabonds. Because, like I said, sometimes her work can be a little bit dense and a little bit difficult to get into. But she is worth sticking with. This is Zhao Haihong. Zhao Haihong is um, another very well-known science fiction editor who also writes. She is seen as a real advocate for the development of science fiction in China. She has had a huge role in nurturing and encouraging emerging voices. So, as an editor, she's taken her job very seriously at looking at the upcoming talents, looking at the kind of older of Generation Z. I call them Generation Z. I suppose they are probably Generation Z if it's an Americanism, and the upcoming generation alpha, looking at those writers and seeing who can be championed. And she's amazing at being a champion of new voices. Um, she isn't as well recognized outside of China as some of the other people that we've looked at this afternoon. But if you have the opportunity and if you have the time, investigating her, finding some of her works is well worth it because I sometimes feel like she hides her own light under a bit of a bushel because she is a fabulous writer in her own right. Chen Shui Fan is another one. He is also known by the Western pen name Stanley Chan. He is very highly regarded in Chinese science fiction. Again, his stories are very insightful, very thought-provoking. They explore the intersection between technology, society, and what it means to be human. So if your sci-fi interest is, is AI alive? Do we have anything to worry about with the artificial intelligence? Can an AI robot die? If that's kind of your bent, then he's your man. He's the person to go to. I would recommend his debut novel, actually, which is called The Waste Tide. It was originally published in 2013 in Chinese. There is an English translation. And that has had critical acclaim because of its vivid depiction of this dystopian future where technology and globalization and environmental issues have all intersected to bring about the end of the world, essentially. And you've then got this compelling imagery of this polluted post-industrial landscape. And again, the social inequality that arise from that technological process. And isn't it fascinating that so many of these writers deal with social inequality, deal with what it is to not be the same, when of course we know that a big part of current Chinese philosophy is everybody is the same, everybody should be the same. Now, if you have ever attended one of my talks before, or indeed in Saoirse's case, if you've ever been taught by me, you will know that I can talk and we have run out of time, which should be no surprise. But like I said, if you are interested, if this is kind of your thing and you would like to stay in touch, then please do. My Twitter handle is at Mr. D Lester. That's MRDLESTER, and that's all one word. I will be tweeting out links to some of the works that I've referenced today, so that you can take a look at those. I will make sure that I give names of all of the authors that I've mentioned today and the ones that I had to skip over, so that you can go and investigate them. And again, if anybody would be interested in maybe the existence of a Chinese sci-fi or a Chinese sci-fi and fantasy, or just an Asian sci-fi and fantasy Zoom book club, then again, get in touch on Twitter, let me know, and I will be more than delighted to put that together. I would like to thank you all so much for joining me this afternoon. I hope that I have been worth your time. I hope that even though we've had to go through this very quickly, because 45 minutes is nowhere near enough time to cover everything that we could have covered today, I hope this has been a good primer for you in Chinese science fiction. And I hope that you will now go off and explore the genre a little bit more on your own so that you can know exactly where we're coming from. I hope you have a great rest of the weekend. Please enjoy everything else that Language Show has to offer. Thank you so much once again. And yeah, please do stay in touch. Please do stay in touch because it has been my pleasure to speak with you this afternoon. Thank you all. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it. Thank you, Chris. I'm glad that you enjoyed it. Thank you, Saoirse. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. It was nice to see you again. Thank you, Sante. I appreciate you coming. Yes, I think that this was good, Nicole, for the Christmas list. Mine, since doing some of the research, mine has grown exponentially. So, I'm sure that partners and relatives won't thank me, but you are absolutely right. Thank you all so much. I will speak to you soon. 再见.